AITA for calling out my husband's coworker at his corporate party for flirting with him right in front of me? This was supposed to be one of those special nights. After years of hearing stories about my husband's coworkers, I'd finally get to meet the people he spends so many hours with every week. We'd been married for 6 years, but given how busy we both were with work and family life, this was a first. It felt like an opportunity to show up as a united front. A chance to celebrate his career. And maybe, just maybe, get a little glimpse into this other part of his life. For a few days leading up to the event, I planned everything carefully. I found the perfect outfit. Something classy but not too flashy. And picked out the ideal shoes to match. It was my way of signaling that I was invested in supporting his career. That I cared about getting to know the people who helped shape his work life. I wanted to meet his colleagues and maybe even feel a bit of pride seeing him in his professional element. Talking shop and looking like the man who first captivated me with his ambition and easy charm. When we walked into the venue, I felt that giddy excitement you get when stepping into something new. There was laughter everywhere, people mingling, little clusters of coworkers sharing jokes and stories. It was a warm atmosphere. And as he introduced me around, everyone seemed friendly and welcoming. It was strange to realize how many faces I recognized from his stories over the years. There was Kevin, the office jokester, and Marie, his boss, who greeted us warmly, all confirming my impression of a fun, close-knit group. As we sat down at a table with his team, I felt a genuine sense of belonging. I got along well with his coworkers, smiling through their shared anecdotes and absorbing every word. These people had seen my husband in a way I hadn't. They were his work family. And I was glad to meet them. It was a new layer of connection. A chance to feel closer to him by getting to know his work life. The first part of the evening went just as I'd hoped. I felt like I'd made a good impression, joining in on light conversations, laughing when appropriate, and just letting myself be part of his world. For a while, I let my guard down, trusting that we were among friends. But looking back, I realize I was a bit naive in assuming that everyone shared my intentions. About an hour into the evening, as everyone relaxed into the party atmosphere, I noticed her, a woman across the table, a coworker I'd heard of before. Though not in much detail, she was dressed impeccably, every bit the confident professional. At first, I didn't think much of her. She seemed nice enough, engaged in a lively conversation with a couple of people seated beside her. I was busy trying to get to know everyone, asking questions, and smiling at the stories they shared about office life. But then something changed. It started with a look, a simple glance directed at my husband. That, alone, wouldn't have raised any red flags. But it was the way she held his gaze for just a second too long. A kind of knowing look that made me uneasy. The first time, I brushed it off as my imagination. Just a little paranoia creeping in. But then, as the evening continued, she kept looking his way. Each time with the same smile. Like they shared some private joke or history I wasn't aware of. I tried to ignore it, reminding myself that they were coworkers, probably friendly enough to have their own quirks. But the way her gaze lingered on him, at first briefly, then more intently, with a subtle wink here and there, made it impossible to stay unaffected. She'd glance at him, hold his gaze, and then look away, as though the exchange meant nothing. It was maddeningly casual yet oddly intimate, and the more I noticed it, the more I felt a pit of discomfort growing inside me. A few minutes later, I leaned over to my husband, attempting to keep my voice light, and asked if there was something I should know. He looked at me, clearly taken aback, and said, "It's just office banter," brushing it off like it was nothing. I could tell he was uncomfortable with my question, so I let it go, not wanting to start anything that might ruin our night. But something about his casual dismissal felt off. It was as if he didn't want to acknowledge what I'd been seeing. The rational part of me told myself I was overthinking, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I watched as a few other coworkers started to chime in with little jokes, making passing remarks like, "You two just can't help yourselves," or, "Don't you miss sitting next to each other every day?" Every word was like a tiny barb, poking at my patience and chipping away at my composure. And while he laughed it off, I noticed he never fully denied it or set any boundaries. Instead, he seemed to deflect, laughing along and shrugging off the comments without giving them much attention. I could feel my pulse racing, frustration and hurt building as I sat there, feeling increasingly isolated. A part of me wanted to stand up and tell them to knock it off. To make it clear that whatever joke they thought they were in on wasn't funny. But I held back, determined not to create a scene. I kept hoping my husband would step in, but he remained silent, unbothered, or maybe just unwilling to confront it. As the evening wore on, my unease only grew. The way she continued to glance at him, with her knowing smiles and subtle winks, started to feel like an intentional challenge, almost as if she enjoyed seeing my discomfort. Every time she'd catch his eye, I'd feel my patience thin a little more. Yet, I told myself that confronting her, or even him, in front of everyone was a terrible idea. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as insecure or to embarrass him in front of his colleagues. I took a deep breath, hoping that if I could just make it through the night, we'd have a conversation about it in private. But things only got worse. At one point, she excused herself from the table and made a show of crossing over to the bar. When she returned, she deliberately paused right beside him, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder as she handed him a drink. It was a simple gesture, maybe even something I could have dismissed, if it hadn't been accompanied by another one of her lingering looks and a barely there smile. The people around us chuckled, one of his friends nudging him and saying, "Looks like someone's eager for someone on one time." They all laughed, and my husband joined in, brushing off the comment with a casual shrug, as if nothing about the situation was unusual. But my heart was pounding. I felt completely blindsided by his indifference. And the more they carried on, the more trapped I felt in the moment. I couldn't understand how he didn't see what I was seeing. Or worse, how he could see it and choose to ignore it. I leaned over to him again, keeping my voice low, and asked if he was really comfortable with all of this. His response was dismissive, yet again, telling me that I was overthinking it and that these comments and gestures were nothing but harmless office banter. But as he looked back at me, I could tell he was starting to get irritated by my questioning. Like I was somehow causing the issue. The dismissal in his tone stung. I tried to hold my composure, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, but a part of me knew that wasn't true. The words and glances, the looks from his coworkers, and his failure to put a stop to any of it were impossible to ignore. The final straw came when she returned from the bar once more. This time without the pretense of bringing a drink, but still with that look in her eye, a look that made it clear she knew she had my husband's attention. And by extension, mine. And that's when I snapped. In that instant, everything inside me boiled over. I could feel my heart racing as I sat there, trying to calm the surge of frustration and betrayal that had been simmering all evening. But I just couldn't take it anymore. The forced laughter, the coy glances, the barely concealed flirting, none of it was harmless fun to me. I leaned forward, looked across the table at her, and without filtering a single thought, spoke in a voice louder than I intended. "If there's something you two want to share, I'm sure we'd all love to hear it." The entire table went silent, the laughter dying mid-chuckle. I could see her expression freeze, her face quickly going pale, then pink as embarrassment swept over her. She stammered something, muttering about needing the restroom, and quickly excused herself from the table. All eyes turned to me. Some people looked uncomfortable, others glanced at my husband, their faces a mixture of surprise and barely hidden amusement. I didn't care. The weight that had been pressing on my chest all evening lifted, and I felt a strange satisfaction at finally saying what I was feeling, even if the moment wasn't perfectly graceful. Then I looked at my husband. His face was a mix of shock and anger. He didn't say anything at first, just shook his head in disbelief, clearly trying to hold back his irritation. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and his silence spoke louder than any outburst could have. Eventually, he leaned toward me, his voice low but seething. "You just embarrassed me in front of everyone," he muttered through clenched teeth. I wanted to tell him how embarrassed I felt, watching him let his coworker flirt with him, tolerating her glances, her winks, her lingering touches. But in that moment, with all his anger directed at me. I couldn't find the words. Somehow, in his mind, this entire evening had twisted, leaving me as the villain. Not her for crossing boundaries. Not him for letting it happen. But me, for calling it out. He didn't look at me for the rest of the evening. The people around us tried to recover from the tension I'd introduced, shifting back to small talk and inside jokes. Though I could tell everyone felt the lingering awkwardness. And as the night wore on, I felt myself shrink more and more, wondering if I had made a massive mistake. The drive home was heavy with silence, and I could feel my husband's anger like a palpable weight pressing in on me. I wanted to break the silence, to explain why I'd reached my breaking point, but his clenched jaw and narrowed eyes were a clear message, not a word. We both sat in that uneasy quiet, with the glow of streetlights casting shifting shadows inside the car, mirroring the turmoil brewing between us. Once we got home, he barely looked at me as he went straight to the bedroom, leaving me standing in the entryway, wondering how things had unraveled so quickly. This wasn't how I'd imagined us handling a situation that hurt me so deeply. But there I was, alone with my frustration and embarrassment. I wanted to believe that after he calmed down, he'd be open to a conversation, to understand why I felt so disrespected. Yet, a part of me knew that he felt blindsided, humiliated in front of his colleagues, and that he likely saw the whole ordeal as my fault. After a restless night of replaying the evening in my mind, I went to the kitchen the next morning to find him drinking coffee at the table, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. It was almost surreal, how he seemed to carry on without a word about the tension between us. I took a deep breath and broke the silence, hoping for some middle ground. "Can we talk about last night?" I asked, carefully choosing my words. He sighed, putting his mug down a little too forcefully. "What's there to talk about? You embarrassed me. I can't believe you made such a scene over something so trivial." Trivial? I felt the word sting. "You don't think it's a problem that she was openly flirting with you? That your friends even joked about it? And you just went along with it?" He shook his head, his gaze steely. "It was harmless. That's just how she is with everyone. She's friendly. She's playful. You took it too far." I took a deep breath, fighting the lump in my throat. It didn't feel harmless. It felt disrespectful, to me, and you didn't do anything to stop it. You let her treat me like I wasn't even there. He crossed his arms, looking frustrated. "You think I should have made a scene? Over something that was nothing? Look, you need to learn to handle your insecurities. Not everything is an attack on you." His words struck like a slap. I wanted to shout that this wasn't about insecurity, that it was about boundaries, respect, and the way he made me feel invisible. But I knew he wouldn't see it that way. In his mind, he was the wronged party, and my feelings were a problem to be handled. I could feel a wave of exhaustion wash over me, and I realized I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. Without another word, I went to the living room, letting the silence settle between us again. This time, though, the silence felt colder, sharper. The evening had left a wound, not just in our relationship but in my own heart. It stung to feel as if my concerns, my hurt, meant nothing to him. For the first time in a long time, I found myself wondering if I was fighting alone in this relationship. If the respect I'd assumed we both valued had somehow slipped through the cracks without me noticing. And as the morning sunlight streamed in through the blinds, I couldn't help but question where this left us, or if my concerns would ever really matter to him at all. The days that followed felt strange, like we were both walking on broken glass, trying not to disturb the fragile calm. My husband and I existed in the same house, went through the motions of our routines, yet spoke to each other as little as possible. He spent more time at work, and when he was home, he was either absorbed in his phone or watching TV with the volume turned up just enough to discourage conversation. I was torn between wanting to bridge the gap and feeling utterly defeated. Every attempt I'd made to express myself had been brushed off, minimized, or dismissed. It felt as if he was waiting for me to apologize, to come around and admit that I had been out of line. But I couldn't bring myself to apologize for having feelings, for wanting my boundaries respected. The silence between us turned my thoughts into a constant echo, amplifying my doubt and questioning every move I'd made that night at the party. Was I too harsh? Did I read too much into things? I wanted to confide in someone. To hear an outside perspective that would either validate or challenge my emotions. But I couldn't bear the idea of dragging anyone else into this. Of admitting how fragile things had become. A few days later, as I was preparing dinner alone, he walked into the kitchen and casually mentioned that he was going to another work event that weekend, a team-building retreat that I'd heard nothing about until that moment. Are spouses allowed? I asked, trying to sound neutral. It's just for the team. He replied quickly, barely looking up as he poured himself a glass of water. The implication was clear. This was an event I wasn't welcome to attend. And by the look in his eyes, he seemed relieved. My chest tightened as I imagined him there, surrounded by the same colleagues who'd watched our tension unfold at the party. The same people who'd teased him and his coworker so casually. A sense of isolation crept in. It was like he had drawn a line between his professional life and me. As if the two couldn't coexist. After he left for the weekend, I sat alone in our quiet home, wondering if this was how things would be from now on. I started replaying moments from our past. The times when I'd felt cherished and respected. The early years when we'd tackle life together. Always on the same side. Now it felt as if we were on opposite teams, each waiting for the other to concede. That weekend, I realized something unsettling. I'd always believed that a marriage could weather storms. But I was beginning to feel the toll of constant misunderstandings. Like I was shouldering a burden he didn't even acknowledge. It was a hollow, lonely feeling. The sense that I'd become invisible in my own marriage. When he returned, things were different, colder. He barely spoke about the retreat, brushing off my questions with short, indifferent answers. The unspoken divide between us only grew wider. And I started to question if the man who'd once made me feel seen, heard, and loved was still standing by my side, or if I was now just someone he tolerated. After that weekend, it was as if an invisible wall had been built between us. And neither of us was willing to make the first move to tear it down. Every attempt I made to bring up the situation was met with short, dismissive responses, and I could feel him shutting down emotionally. Retreating further into a world I wasn't allowed access to. He spent more time working late or attending social gatherings with his coworkers. Never once inviting me or even mentioning them until the day after. I started feeling like an outsider in my own marriage, questioning if our relationship was ever as solid as I'd believed. I couldn't shake the feeling that my husband's silence was more than anger or embarrassment, it was avoidance. He wasn't just distancing himself from the conflict. He was distancing himself from me. The most painful part was that, despite everything, I still loved him. I wanted to fix things. To understand what had gone wrong and how we could get back to where we used to be. But every time I tried to talk, to express my concerns and fears, he either brushed me off or changed the subject. He wouldn't give me the reassurance I craved. The acknowledgement that he understood why I was upset and that he cared enough to try and make things right. One night, I sat alone in the darkened living room, my mind racing through all the changes I'd noticed in him since the party. My own frustrations and hurt had built up, and I felt as though I was caught in a never-ending loop of emotional turmoil. But in that quiet, painful moment, I also came to a realization. I couldn't force him to see things from my perspective or to value my feelings. I could only decide how much I was willing to tolerate. I knew I needed to protect my sense of self, to take back some control over my happiness and well-being. I couldn't let myself be reduced to someone who was simply there in the background, silently supporting him while he disregarded my needs. So, I started to shift my focus from our relationship to myself. I reconnected with friends, spent time on hobbies I'd neglected, and rediscovered the parts of myself that I'd let slip in my pursuit of being a good partner. It wasn't easy. And it didn't erase the pain I felt over the rift between us. But it reminded me of the importance of my own identity outside of our marriage. To my surprise, he barely seemed to notice the changes. If anything, he acted as if he was relieved I wasn't pushing for answers anymore. I saw it in his eyes. A quiet acceptance that things had shifted. Though whether he even cared was anyone's guess. It hurt to feel so invisible. To watch him pull away and see our connection fade. But I told myself that I deserved more than a marriage built on avoidance and disregard. I deserved respect, honesty, and a partner who valued my presence as much as I valued his. And in that moment, I resolved to find my own peace, even if it meant facing the reality that our marriage might never be the same again. As weeks turned into months, the distance between us grew more palpable. Our home felt like a tense, silent battleground where every glance or movement was measured, cautious, as if we both knew a single misstep could shatter what little remained of our marriage. I kept hoping he would acknowledge the chasm growing between us, that he would reach out and find some way to reconnect. But he didn't. He seemed content to exist in this detached space, where we were little more than two people sharing a house. I'd always believed that communication could bridge any gap, but no amount of effort on my part seemed to bring him closer. My attempts to discuss our feelings or bring some kind of resolution were met with his quiet deflections or outright dismissals. I'm too tired for this right now, or, can we just not, felt like a small rejection. A reminder that my feelings had become inconvenient to him. But the final straw came one evening. During a rare night out with friends. They'd sensed the shift in me and were gently trying to pull me out of my emotional rut. In a way, it was refreshing to have people around who seemed genuinely interested in my well-being. As we chatted over dinner, I began to share what had been weighing on my heart, the loneliness, the coldness at home, the feeling that I was slowly slipping into a version of myself I barely recognized. At some point, one friend, who had known us for years, leaned over and said, "I've noticed he's changed, too. He's more withdrawn, even when we see him with his colleagues. Are you sure there's nothing he's hiding?" The question, though innocent, felt like a punch to the gut. It echoed the nagging doubts that had been swirling in the back of my mind. The suspicions I'd tried so hard to push away. I'd told myself I was overreacting, that he was simply going through something. But here was an outside perspective, an observation that wasn't tainted by my own anxieties. That night, I sat alone in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing with all the little inconsistencies I'd noticed since the party. Every late night, every excuse, every dismissive glance felt like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to complete. As much as I wanted to believe that nothing was amiss, there was a voice in the back of my mind whispering that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't imagining things. I decided that I needed clarity, even if it meant facing a truth that could shatter me. When I got home, I confronted him directly. I told him I needed to know if there was something going on that I should be aware of, if there was any truth to the suspicions that had taken root in my heart. I laid it all out. Told him how his behavior, the flirtation at the party, and the way he'd been so distant made me feel like he was hiding something. His response was a weary sigh and a dismissive wave of his hand. "You're overthinking everything again," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "I told you before, it was just harmless fun. And you blew it out of proportion." But something had changed in me that night. I wasn't content to accept his brush off. Wasn't willing to quiet my own intuition for the sake of maintaining a false sense of peace. I told him, as calmly as I could, that I deserved honesty and respect. If he was unwilling to give me that, then maybe he didn't value our relationship as much as I thought he did. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between irritation and resignation. "If that's what you need to believe," he said coldly, "then fine, think whatever you want." The dismissal in his tone stung more deeply than I could have anticipated. It was in that moment I realized he wasn't going to fight for us. He wasn't willing to put in the effort to mend what had been broken. He had already chosen apathy over honesty, detachment over connection, and with that realization came a painful clarity. I could keep trying to bridge the gap. Keep investing myself in a relationship where I was the only one fighting. Or I could let go. I could choose to stop giving pieces of myself to someone who seemed so indifferent to losing them. That night, I slept in the guest room, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. I knew that the marriage we'd built was crumbling. But I also knew I'd reached a breaking point. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being for a relationship that no longer felt like a partnership. It was time to face the possibility of a life without him. To find a way to reclaim the parts of myself I'd lost along the way. In the weeks that followed, I focused on what it would mean to truly let go. The process wasn't just about leaving my marriage, it was about piecing myself back together from the fragments I'd given up. Slowly reconstructing a version of myself I could live with. I began to confront what it would mean to walk away from someone I'd once considered my other half. Knowing that he no longer even resembled the man I thought I'd married. We slipped into an uncomfortable, silent coexistence in the house. Every exchange between us was terse and calculated. Like we were both biding time. Waiting for the inevitable. I started preparing for the practicalities. 2. How I would manage financially. Where I might go if we split the house. At first, these thoughts had filled me with dread. But as I embraced them more, they became strangely empowering. I was beginning to see that I could create a life outside of this marriage. One where I could reclaim the joy and independence I had lost. One night, I started boxing up a few personal items from our shared bedroom. Just seeing them laid out, their importance no longer tied to this place or our relationship, was an unexpected relief. They were things I'd once cherished. Symbols of love and unity. But now, stripped of the emotional weight they once held, they simply became things again, reminders that I was, in some ways, rediscovering myself. Friends began to notice the changes in me. Some reached out, asking if I was okay. Sensing that something had shifted, I shared bits and pieces of what I was going through, careful not to vent too much. It was hard enough feeling isolated in my marriage. I didn't want to feel as though I was isolated from the world. 2. But their kindness reminded me that support existed beyond the walls of my home. That I wasn't truly alone. Even if the person closest to me had drifted away. My husband's reactions to all of this were, predictably passive. If he noticed my slow retreat from our shared life, he didn't say anything. The man who once used to ask me about my day and share his dreams now barely glanced up when I entered the room. His silence felt like a constant, heavy cloud hanging over us. A confirmation of how far we'd strayed from the couple we used to be. I could feel the resentment and bitterness hardening in me. And I knew I had to make a decision before I lost sight of my own principles. One evening, as I was packing away a few more things, I found an old photo of us from our first anniversary. We looked so young and hopeful, arms wrapped around each other with nothing but promise in our eyes. I traced the edges of the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We'd once had dreams, plans, and what felt like an unbreakable bond. Somewhere along the line, life had chipped away at that. And now we were little more than strangers. I felt a pang of grief for what we'd lost. But the sorrow was soon replaced by acceptance. This was our reality, as painful as it was to face. A few days later, I took a deep breath and told him I was ready to move forward with the separation. For once, he seemed taken aback, as though he hadn't really believed it would come to this. He stared at me, and I thought I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Perhaps even regret, but he said nothing to stop me. He simply nodded, as if he too had come to terms with the fact that there was nothing left for us to salvage. I moved out a few weeks later. The first night in my new place was surreal and silent. I was surrounded by boxes of things that once felt part of a shared life but now belonged to me alone. I felt a strange mix of liberation and loss, as though I were stepping into a life I'd long forgotten how to live. The silence was daunting, but there was also peace in it, a peace that came from knowing I'd finally taken a step to reclaim my happiness. Even if that path was uncertain and filled with unknowns, it was a step toward myself. And in that moment, it felt like the right one. Months have passed, and while life still holds the echoes of what I left behind, I'm learning to walk in a different direction, a path I once believed had been closed to me. The strange thing about separation, about letting go, is that it brings an oddly beautiful clarity, a shedding of layers I didn't know I was wearing. I feel lighter, but I also feel more open, raw, and vulnerable, which sometimes makes the simplest things, like cooking for one, or coming home to an empty place, feel momentous. But these quiet moments also remind me of what I was seeking all along, a place of peace. A sense of self that's finally mine again. Sometimes, memories of that difficult night resurface. I remember the discomfort and my surge of anger at his coworker's flirtations. The uneasy knowledge that my relationship was slipping through my fingers. But the turmoil that night exposed has also given way to a new sense of gratitude. I know I made mistakes. Holding on too tightly, trying to protect a marriage that was crumbling. Perhaps because I feared the unknown. Yet, walking through that discomfort taught me something vital: to prioritize myself, to respect my own needs, and to no longer overlook the little things that make me me. Healing isn't linear, nor is it a destination, it's a process. One I'm discovering in everyday life. I'm finding joy in routines I never had before. Hobbies that I had let fall by the wayside. Friends who were once on the periphery have become my support network, bringing laughter and warmth back into my days. It's a slow rebuilding of a world I'd let grow smaller over the years. And with each step, I'm reclaiming parts of myself that I had nearly forgotten. And, perhaps unexpectedly, I feel gratitude for my ex, too. Our time together shaped me, even in ways I couldn't see in the moment. It taught me resilience, self-worth, and the strength to stand up for my own happiness. I realize now that, in every challenge, there is a lesson. In every struggle, a path forward. It's a journey I never anticipated, but one I'm thankful to be on. Life doesn't look how I once thought it would, but it's mine now, completely, imperfectly mine, and that, I've learned, is more than enough.